You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Well, happy Friday evening, folks. It's Friday, the end of the week. Imagine that. We made it another week. But I'm going to make a prediction for you. My prediction is this whole coronavirus thing and all the racial riots, you're going to see them, no matter what the election outcomes, you're going to see them come to a screeching halt and disappear magically by the second week in November. And we'll talk about that a little bit. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my program, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. And you can come over to my YouTube channel, join the live chat room that's going on right now, watch this in its video simulcast at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. By the way, you can find all the archives of every show that I've done on Odyssey Radio, plus a bunch of other things I did before Odyssey, over on my YouTube channel. There's over 222 shows from Odyssey Radio that are archived over on my YouTube channel, plus probably about another 100 of them down below that from times before I started with Odyssey. So come on over, see all the goodness that is my channel. And I welcome you to the show tonight. Now, I start with a kind of I don't even know where I'm going to go with tonight, by the way. I just turned on the mic and said, let's roll it. And I haven't looked at what I want to talk about tonight. I do want to continue with my series on Native America and the conquest of the American West. We're going to get to that. And as I've said, this show isn't about politics. And even when I talk about a political topic as kind of a warm-up at the beginning or a comment on current events, I don't see it as being political more than I see it as commenting on the events that are going on around us, on the human condition, on human nature, on just current affairs as they affect us. Let's take it out of the political camp. If I was politicizing, I would be saying, here's who to vote for, here's why, and here's why the other guy is bad. And I do some of that. I'm not a big Joe Biden fan. I will state for the record, if I have not stated it here, I know I've stated it in text many times, is that I don't think Joe Biden is a bad man. I think he's a bad candidate for president. I think that things that the detractors of the current sitting president, of President Trump, that he was insane or mentally incapacitated or all of those were all just fomenting from the left and from his detractors. We've seen many times over that Trump is not lacking in his mental facilities. However, I look at Joe Biden and I say, this is a man who is... Not everybody at age 77 is slipping mentally, but I think that he is, and I think that there are demonstrable evidences to show that Joe Biden has slipped mentally. I don't say this as a criticism of him. I don't say it as a political ploy. I look at him, and I've said, down through the years, I've traditionally been conservative. And I've seen Joe Biden operate over the last 30 years to 40 years almost in government. And I always respected him. I didn't always like his political ideology or agree with him. But I always thought he was a very likable person. And politics aside, I thought Joe Biden was a very good man. And he stood for what he believed in. And you can parse that all down all you want to look at things he voted for, things he's saying differently now than he said back then. Everybody does that. We all grow, we all evolve, we all learn. I don't hold certain votes that Joe took 25 years ago to necessarily be valid as to where he stands on things today. Events around us, world events, politics, everything changes from day to day. Now, I can say I've usually been very conservative all the way along. That will stay with me. Joe Biden, he's always been a liberal. That will always stay with him. Particular issues and views can change, however, on certain items depending on how you view what it's doing in the public circus, what's going on in government, what's going on in the world around us. Now, you might want to say, well, Joe Biden's a thief. He colluded with China. He supported segregation, things like that. Those are all things you can put in the political kettle and set over here. That's all simmering back there as a political argument. The man himself, I thought, was a decent guy. Now, this is, of course, before all the charges of sexual impropriety or harassment or things like that. But didn't we see all of that against Trump as well? It's all kind of a pick and choose what you want to believe these days. There would have to be strong evidence to use that as a reason to dislike Joe Biden. Is he a creepy guy? Maybe. Maybe he's gotten creepier in his old age. I don't know. So I don't know that for a fact. So let's take that and set that in another kettle over here. That's a different issue. When I'm talking about Joe Biden, can you be a creepy guy and like women and act inappropriately and still be a decent person? I think there are people like that. I think he comes from a bygone era where, you just turn on the show Mad Men about ad agency people in the 60s and the early 70s. You get an idea of the era that Joe Biden was strong in. And the way they treated women in the workplace, things like that. As I said many years ago, it's getting to the place where you can't even look at a woman in the workplace and smile and say, hey, nice dress. Suddenly you're harassing. So times have changed, certainly. Take that, push that aside again. Joe Biden, I think, was always a decent guy. No matter what has happened to him in recent years. I saw, and this is what I've stated in writing before, when Joe Biden's older son died a few years ago, I think it took the fire out of his belly. I think he lost momentum. I know how I would feel if one of my sons died. I don't care if my son was 30 or 40 years old. My sons right now are 19 and 10, going on 11. And it would crush me if one of my sons were to die. And I think that crushed Joe Biden. I think he loves his family. I think he loved his children. And I think when his son died, he lost a little fire in the belly. I think at that point, he was looking forward to the end of his political career. He capped it off at Vice President of the United States, a feat not many people reach. And he, I think, just wanted to retire and go fishing. Nothing wrong with that. Retire with a decent legacy. You're not going to please all the people all the time with your politics or your political ideology, but he could retire with, I think, a safe legacy that he did what he believed were good things to do. Whether you agree with him or not, or whether they were politically correct by today's standards or not. So Joe Biden, I think he lost a lot of, what do you want to call it? A lot of forward momentum. I said fire in the belly already. I think he wasn't ready to fight anymore. I'm done. I just want to call it quits. He's going to retire and live the rest of his life as a wealthy dude. He's going to have a legacy he could fall back on. He's going to be called on to give speeches and things like that. And then in his off time, he's going to go fishing. And Ronald Reagan went horseback riding. Of course, Ronald Reagan was also falling into dementia toward the end of his presidency. And we saw the signs of it. And a few years after he was out of office, he slipped pretty badly. And so Joe Biden got dragged back in, kicking and screaming into the political spotlight by the Democratic Party. It's not that they didn't have anybody good to offer up within their party, depending, political ideology notwithstanding. They had decent, young, astute minds, whether you agreed with political philosophy or not. But they all seemed to, remember that back a few months ago, a 2 or 3 day period, all the candidates dropped out and threw their support behind Joe Biden. Now, Joe Biden, I think, didn't want to run for president. You saw it in the early days of, about a year ago. People were asking him, "You're going to run for president?" And he wouldn't give an answer. He was like, I don't think he wanted to do it. I think he was done. And the problem is somebody convinced him that he needed to be in the running. And they dragged him in. And what have we seen since that's happened? We've seen Joe declining even more. Dementia is a swift thing. It doesn't always happen over a period of years, although you can measure it by years by looking. I think once somebody starts to slip, it starts to slip. So what is the motivating factor for Joe to run? I think the motivating factor is probably he's either been talked to or he hasn't been, and he's totally unaware of it. Probably that he will be replaced very quickly in office. He will be found to not be sound, or he will willingly step down to his vice president because he's realizing, hey, folks, I ran, and you know what? I'm president now, but my health is failing, my mental capacities are failing, I'm going to step down. And you've got the vice president as president. So I think that's kind of a scenario we can see happening without ascribing conspiracy theory to it. I think it's a strategy that the Democratic Party is working on. Otherwise, why would you support Joe Biden? Why would you push somebody who is obviously suffering a bit from encroaching dementia, encroaching mental illness at his age, pushing 80, and try to push him into office as the highest executive in the land? Either the presidency isn't that important, or there is a plan behind it. And I tend to go with both of those. I think the presidency is a figurehead for what's really going on behind the scenes. It's the legislature, it's the Congress that runs the country. Now, having said all that, I feel bad for Joe Biden right now. I really wish he was not in a position where stepping down would be something that's just untenable in his position right now. He has to follow through. And whether he knows this or not, whether he really believes he is the answer for America right now, I think that's highly dubious. So, there's Joe Biden. President Trump was elected because people felt he was going to do something. He was the voice of the people. He was somebody who could... Here, I had a conversation this morning with a good friend of mine, and he put it this way. Let's see. In our conversation, it was a text message conversation, and he started off by saying, well, if I can find it, I'll let you know. I hit the wrong button. Here we are. He started off this morning. This is the first thing my friend said to me this morning. Listen to this. He said, Trump will lose the election. Lately, he's looked pretty defeated. He has plenty of valid reasons to be pissed about how his presidency was violated and upended by the corrupt media and liberal snakes. but he's also a loudmouth dolt who can't keep his mouth shut, who hasn't shown leadership, and at a time when he could have stepped up to demonstrate some conviction, he failed. Didn't we always know this was how it was going to end? Did any of us really believe this was the man of the ages? No, we all knew, save for a few, that this president was as real as TV show Trump. The November election will be a train wreck, and it's looking worse, and it's looking more and more like we will not only lose the White House, but the Senate as well. What the fuck, he says. And that's when I gave my prediction. I put it on my Facebook right after I typed it to him. I said, I have a prediction. The virus and the racial tensions and riots are all going to come to a screaming magical halt the second week in November, because the elections will be over. I believe that what we have seen over the last several months from coronavirus, and the virus is a real thing, I think it has been used and manipulated by politicos to adversely affect the sitting president. And it's a useful tool. It's been used. And the problem is, he maybe hasn't risen to the occasion as best he could have. And I said, Trump is going to have to pull a magic rabbit out of his ass at this point with things that are going on. Now, don't let that discourage you. If you're a Trump supporter, you still go out and vote for the man. You still try to make it happen. You still put your trust in the man that you think can pull it through. I have always said of Trump, I think he's a lot more intelligent than a lot of people like to say he is. Everything we've seen where it seems like he's dipping, he comes back because he had a strategy in place. While it looked like he was dipping, his strategy, he was working on it. Is he going to be able to do that now through all of these crises? And my friend went on to say, you might be right. I think the virus is a clusterfuck, but it wasn't fake. He didn't handle it well. I think his response to the riots was his final undoing. The cynical walk to the church, holding up a Bible he's probably never read. Ugh, my friend said. There's a sense that we have no national leadership. I also have a sense that our country is coming apart, and we will soon discover that Biden is no leader either. It's not going to be fun. Trump was our last stand as conservatives. Unfortunately, it was the right idea with the wrong man. That's my friend's opinion on that. Now, he's always kind of held that opinion, but there have been times where he's come through and said, wow, Trump really came through on that. You know, you might be changing my mind. He was not a Trump supporter. And this is a friend of mine who was very liberal at one time. He's now more of a libertarian. I responded and said, it's going to be a tumultuous 4 years ahead. And my friend said, I think the left will overplay its hand. It always does. That's what they're doing now. The left has latched on to the virus, and they're trying to push that out as long as they can. When you don't have Americans out in the workplace, out rubbing shoulders with each other, out sharing ideas, out watching the news together, discussing what's going on, that's right where, pardon me if you're a Democrat, I believe that's where the Democrat Party wants them all. That's politics. That's the political game that's being played. If you can keep people at home, if you can push a vote by mail where people don't have to go out to the polls, if you can push keeping people sequestered, you're going to get a different response than if people weren't. So I believe, and there's been rumblings from people in Congress, people who know people in Congress who have overheard conversations. That's all hearsay at this point, but the rumblings saying they have heard people say if we can just push the sequestration out to November, we'll win the election. This is from the left. And that is a valid thing that's been said. Can you tack it down and say this person said this? No. The whole Ocasio-Cortez post was more an expression of the ideas that they support as opposed to what she may have actually said in a tweet. And I said to my friend, I said, Trump was good until these two crises were invented. And I said, and he said, invented the virus? And I said, used is probably a better way to put that. And he said, it's media malpractice. And I said, malfeasance at its best is the way the media has latched on all this and used it. My friend said this: no matter what happens, I do believe we're going to see attempts to pass a constitutional amendment or constitutional amendments to the First and the Second Amendments, free speech and the right to bear arms. And speech is going to be curtailed at the very least through regulation. And that's dangerous territory, I said to him. I think the radical left is going to try to rewrite the entire Constitution, says my friend. And I said, they're already trying to circumvent it. He said they'll use the Supreme Court justices. It's a much more effective way. You can't yell, pardon me for saying this, you can't yell faggot in a crowded theater. We'll get Imagine. John Lennon sung Imagine as the national anthem. That's already been thrown up on Twitter as a suggestion. I said, Jesus, spare me. And it was trending on Twitter. And my friend said, I personally don't care. I don't think anthems are necessary or important. I'm not a big on patriotism. And that's kind of where we ended the conversation because it was coming in to do the show. And so there's some truth to all of that when you look at this. What's going on right now? Is Trump reelectable? If you support Trump or if you're conservative, you need to look at that strong and hard right now. Is he reelectable? At this point, it's a toss-up because of the way these crises are being used. The coronavirus, the racial tensions, the rioting. Trump could have done a lot more to solidify a more conservative point of view, more constitutional point of view. And he did not. At least as of today, he has not. Even though he's passing a law to say 10 years in prison if you tear down statues. As a going, they always have the, what do they call it? The standard by which a penalty is issued. So as a standard, that might be a good standard. People will probably get a lot less for that if that's passed into law. What you really need to look at is the legislature, the Congress. What would have happened to the Trump impeachment had there been 5 more members of the Senate who were on the left? That gives you an idea of what would have taken place. Maybe some of you would have liked that. Maybe a lot of us, I think, don't like that. You need that balance of power. Is Trump in a position where the majority of the country is wanting something changed? Many times a president who sits through crises like this, even an incumbent, cannot be reelected. It's tough. It's a long haul unless he does something to counter the problem. I'm still holding out for that. There's still a few months left. We'll see what happens. But that's my political bias as well. So, is Trump reelectable? At this point, it's up in the air. I think you need to look at that, but you need to look at even deeper the political game that is being played. For 50 to 60 years, the left has been promising black America that we're fighting for you. And 15, 60 years later, nothing's happened. They're still fighting the same fight. And why is that? It's not because opportunity doesn't exist. So you need to look at that. Then you need to look at what's going to happen if there is a huge power shift in government. What's going to happen to your Constitution? What's going to happen all around in the United States? Something to think about. We'll get off of this stuff in the next segment. I didn't intend to take the whole first segment to talk about it, but I think you need to think about these things. We all do. Sit tight. We're going to be back in 2 minutes with our topic for tonight.
Are you looking for a really awesome and amazing graphic designer? How about an illustrator or a photographer? This is Rainey Roberts, and I wanted to tell you how you can get my designer, illustrator husband, Scotty Roberts, to work for you on your project. Do you have an awesome self-published book but no cover, or even worse, a cover that really sucks? Do you need a kick-ass logo for your company or some f***ing awesome graphic designs for your ads or website? Then get in touch with my husband for the best f***ing awesome kick-ass design and illustration. He knows his stuff, and he's been at this for more years than I've been alive. Go to ScottAllenRoberts.com. That's Scott with 2 T's, ALANROBERTS.com to take a look at his online portfolio of work, or call 651-468-8115. Now go out and kick some ass with some kick-ass graphic design.
Hire my dad so he can take me to Disneyland.
All right, gang, we're back from that break. Thanks for sitting on, holding on, staying put. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my show, the Intrepid Radio Program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. You're also watching via the simulcast in video with the live chat room and the Intrepheads joining in over at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Welcome to the second segment of the show. Tonight we're talking a lot about looking back in again to the conquest of the American West by white Europeans. Now, I have to put this disclaimer in. I am not talking about white in the way that you're hearing all the political talk about white people. I'm talking about one nationality of people, Europeans, who came over to the New World and found that they could impose their ways on the native peoples that were living here. And this, of course, caused a lot of battling, it caused a lot of conflict, and it eventually ended up with the white settlers, the European settlers, driving the Native Americans off their land and really conquering the American West. And we ended the last segment talking about how Columbus, when he first got here, saw these people. He saw them as decorous and praiseworthy, as peaceful, smiling, loving their neighbors as themselves. He wrote all of this down about them. And all of this, of course, he took as a sign of weakness and felt that he needed to impose European ways upon them. And they undertook to enforce European methods and modes and practices and ways of life on the people of the New World. Now, Columbus kidnapped 10 of his friendly Taino hosts, and he carried them off to Spain. Some of the stories I've heard is he invited them on board ship, and then they set sail. And these guys didn't even know where they were being taken. And he took them to Spain, where they could be introduced to the white man's ways. That was Columbus's purpose. I've got to bring these guys and show them civilization. Now, remember, Columbus lived in an age where slavery was not as anathema as it is today. Slavery was a part of the world. It's the way the world worked. Now, he didn't take them as slaves, but because they were weaker than he was, he thought, and more backwater than they were, he thought by taking them to Spain, he could teach them all about real civilization, not civilization as they knew it and experienced it. And so he kidnapped 10 of them. One of them died soon after landing in Spain. And one of them, and he was also baptized as a Christian before he died. This is the way they thought they were not just teaching them civilization, but saving their souls. And so the Spaniards were so pleased that they'd made it possible for the first Indian to enter heaven that they hastened to spread the good news throughout the West Indies. We have saved the soul of an Indian man. First Indian going to heaven. That bristles me in ways that you don't know. And we won't get into that quite yet, but think about that for a second. We have introduced the Indians to God, and the first Indian has made it into the hands, the folded arms of Jesus in heaven. And so the Tainos and the other Arawak people didn't resist conversion to the Europeans' religion, but they did resist strongly when hordes of these bearded strangers began scouring their islands in search of gold and precious stones. The Spaniards looted and burned villages. They kidnapped hundreds of men, women, and children. They shipped them to Europe to be sold as slaves. For what reason? That they saw them as weak enough to do this to. That they had a simpler civilization than the European civilization. A happier civilization. They shipped them to slave by the hundreds, shipped them to Spain as slaves. The Arawak resistance to this, or they brought on the use of guns and sabers, and whole tribes were wiped out. They were destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of people in less than a decade after Columbus set foot on the beach of San Salvador in 1492. Communications between the tribes of the New World were slow. News of the Europeans' barbarities rarely overtook the rapid spread of new conquests and settlements. Long before the English-speaking white men arrived in Virginia in 1607, however, the Powhatans had heard rumors about the civilizing techniques of the Spaniards, and so the Englishmen used subtler methods. To ensure peace long enough to establish a settlement at Jamestown, they put a golden crown upon the head of Wahun Sonokuk, and they dubbed him the King Powhatan, and they convinced him that he should put his people to work supplying the white settlers with food, with other necessities. Wahun I'm looking for the emphasis on the syllables. Wahun Sonokuk vacillated between loyalty to his rebellious subjects and to the English. But after John Rolfe married his daughter Pocahontas, he apparently decided that he was more English than Indian. And so after Wahun Sonokuk died, the Powhatans rose up in revenge to drive the Englishmen back into the sea from where they'd come. But the Indians underestimated the power of English weapons, and in a short time the 8,000 Powhatans were reduced to less than 1,000 by the English. In Massachusetts, the story began a bit differently, but it ended virtually the same as in Virginia. After the Englishmen landed at Plymouth in 1620, the Pilgrims, most of them, and we get a different picture of the Pilgrims in grade school. We do know that they were fleeing England for religious freedom, but they brought with them the European ways. And most of them probably would have starved to death, except for the aid they received from the friendly natives in the New World. A Pemaquid named Samoset and 3 Wampanagos named Massasoit, Squanto, and Hoboma became self-appointed missionaries to the Pilgrims. The Indians sent their people out to help them. And all of them spoke some English. They were learned from explorers who touched ashore in previous years. And Squanto had been kidnapped by the English, by an English seaman who sold him into slavery in Spain. He's a free man walking around in his world, and he's kidnapped by a British sailor who sells him into slavery in Spain. But he escaped through the aid of another Englishman and finally managed to make it back home to America. And he and the other Indians regarded the Plymouth colonists as they looked at them and saw them as helpless children. Not a derogatory, but they're like kids. They do not know what they're doing. They will kill themselves. And they shared corn with them from the tribal stores. Squanto was the one who showed them how to use fish as fertilizer. They showed them where and how to catch the fish, and they got them through the first winter. And when spring came, they gave the white men some seed corn, showed them how to plant and cultivated it, and for several years, these Englishmen and their Indian neighbors lived in peace. But many more shiploads of white people continued coming ashore. And the ring of axes, the clash of falling trees, echoed up and down the coasts of the land, which the white men now called New England. All of a sudden, could you imagine going out, living here in America, or where you are in Australia or Great Britain? Any of my listeners, look at your home country. If suddenly people started just showing up from somewhere else and started chopping down all your trees, and you're going, hey. And then you find out they've renamed it New England. And so for several years, this is what they did. And settlements began crowding in upon each other. In 1625, 5 years after the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, some of the colonists asked Samoset to give them 12,000 additional acres of Pemaquid land. Now, Samoset knew that land came from the Great Spirit and was as endless as the sky and belonged to no man as property. So to humor these strangers, and in their strange ways, he went through a ceremony of transferring the land and made his mark upon a paper for him. And it was the first deed of Indian land to English colonists. Man, they grasped that as their deed of ownership to that land. Now, most of the other settlers, coming in by thousands at this point, didn't bother to go through such a ceremony. And by the time Massasoit, great chief of the Wampanoags, died in 1662, this is 42 years after the Pilgrims landed, his people were being pushed back into the wilderness. And his son, Metacom, foresaw doom for all Indians unless they united to resist the invaders. How do you think the battling started? You get pushed in far enough away from your homeland, this is what happens. And they weren't hostile to begin with. They became hostile to protect what they had, to protect their homes. And although the New Englanders flattered Metacom by crowning him King Philip of Pokanoket, he devoted most of his time to forming alliances with the Narragansetts and other tribes in the region. And in 1675, again for perspective, this is 55 years after the Pilgrims landed, after a series of arrogant actions by colonists, King Philip Metacom led his Indian Confederacy into a war meant to save the tribes from extinction at the hands of white Europeans. The Indians attacked 52 settlements, completely destroying 12 of them. But after months of fighting, with firepower of the colonists virtually exterminated, the Wampanoags and the Narragansetts. And King Philip was killed, and his head cut off and put on public display, exhibited at Plymouth for nearly 20 years. Along with other captured Indian women and children, King Philip, Metacom's wife, and other captured women, and his young son were sold into slavery in the West Indies. This is what happened to his family. So when the Dutch came to Manhattan Island, Peter Minuit purchased it for 60 guilders in fish hooks and glass beads. But he encouraged the Indians to remain and continued exchanging their valuable peltries for such trinkets. And in 1641, William Kieft levied tribute upon the Mohicans and sent soldiers to Staten Island to punish the Raritans for offenses which had been committed not by them, but by white settlers. The Raritans resisted arrest, and the soldiers killed 4 of them. When the Indians retaliated by killing 4 Dutchmen, Kieft ordered the massacre of 2 entire villages while the inhabitants slept. The Dutch soldiers ran their bayonets through men, women, and children, hacked their bodies to pieces, and then leveled the villages with fire. What kind of public relations do you suppose they were establishing there? This was about 20 years after the Pilgrims had landed. And so for 2 more centuries, these events were repeated again and again as the European colonists moved inland through the passes of the Alleghenies, down the westward flowing rivers to the great waters, the Mississippi, and then up the Great Muddy, the Missouri. The 5 nations of the Iroquois, mightiest and most advanced of all the eastern tribes of the Native Americans, strove in vain for peace with the white Europeans. After years of bloodshed to save their political independence, they finally went down to defeat. Some escaped to Canada, some fled westward, some lived out their lives in reservation confinement. Now, during the 1760s, Pontiac of the Ottawas, not a car, a chief, Pontiac of the Ottawas, united tribes in the Great Lakes country, and that's up where we are now, where I am in Wisconsin, the Great Lakes country, in hopes of driving the British back across the Allegheny Mountains. But he failed. His major error was an alliance with French-speaking white men who withdrew aid from the Peau Rogues, the Redskins, during the crucial siege of Detroit. A generation later, Tecumseh of the Shawnee, he formed a great confederacy of Midwestern and Southern tribes to protect their lands from invasion by the Europeans. The dream ended with Tecumseh's death in battle during the War of 1812. So between 1795 and 1840, the Miamis fought battle after battle. They signed treaty after treaty. They ceded their rich Ohio Valley lands until there was none left to cede. When white settlers began streaming into the Illinois country after the War of 1812, the Sauks, the Foxes, they fled across the Mississippi. And a subordinate chief, Black Hawk, refused to retreat. He created an alliance with the Winnebagos, the Potawatomis, and the Kickapoos, and declared war against new settlements of white Europeans. Look how they were... Stop for a minute. And look at how these people were driven to do what they did. They're painted in American history as hostiles who attacked us. As we were just putting up settlements, they attacked settlers. Well, what's missing in that history that we were taught for many years was that they were driven to the point of defending their homeland. Would not we do the same thing if we were invaded? Yes, we would. Now, times are different, obviously. We have different weapons. We have different kinds of armies. Our nation is different now. It's a nation built by defeating and pushing out the people who lived here. That's just history. You can't change that now. It is what it is now. But what do we do from this point on, having this knowledge? I don't feel guilt. I feel sadness that my ancestors did this way. My ancestors, as I mentioned earlier, came over in 1710 and settled in Virginia, Goochland County, Virginia. By 1710, 90 years after the Pilgrims first set foot at Plymouth Rock, having nothing, there was already Goochland County in Virginia, well established 90 years later. I don't know what part my own ancestors played in their relationships with the Native American tribes. I do know 5 grandsons of John Robards, my ancestor who came over from Wales in 1710, fought in the American Revolution. But look at this now, You're talking 1776 to 1782, in that range of time. You're quite a bit further out from the Pilgrims in 1620, but 150 to 160 years later. So about the time the Civil War in this country to now, that period of time is what it took for us to be engaged in a revolutionary war, defending 13 established colonies. So just to put it in perspective. So it's interesting that a band of Winnebagos, now this is under Black Hawk, remember who I just said had put together the Winnebagos, the Potawatomis, and the Kickapoos and declared war against the new settlements. A band of Winnebagos who accepted a white soldier chief's bribe of 20 horses and $100 betrayed Black Hawk, and he was captured in 1832. He was taken east for imprisonment and display to the curious. And after he died in 1838, 6 years later, the governor of the recently created Iowa Territory obtained Black Hawk's skeleton and kept it on display in his office. That's pretty heinous. You think of that in modern terms. Imagine if the governor of your state kept the skeleton of somebody in his office and put it on display. So in 1829, Andrew Jackson, who was called Sharp Knife by the Indians, took office as the President of the United States. He's on our $50 bill. And during his frontier career, Sharp Knife and his soldiers had killed, murdered thousands of Cherokees, Chickasaws, Choctaws, Creek, and Seminoles. But these southern Indians were still numerous, and they clung stubbornly to their tribal lands, which had been assigned them forever by the white man's treaty in perpetuity. We talked about that before. Many of these treaties contain the terms from the United States to them in perpetuity. Forever, this treaty will stand. And they signed many treaties that had that language in it. In Sharp Knife's first message to his Congress, he recommended that all these Indians be removed westward beyond the Mississippi. Let's get them out of here. And he said, this is a quote from Jackson, "I suggest the propriety of setting apart an ample district west of the Mississippi to be guaranteed to the Indian tribes as long as they shall occupy it." Now, although the enactment of such a law would only add to the long list of broken promises that were made to the Eastern Indians, Sharp Knife was convinced that Indians and whites could not live together in peace. You know what that meant? They can't live together in peace because we keep taking their shit from them. And they get pissed off about it. We can't live at peace with these people. From a 21st century perspective, you shake your head at this. And his plan would make it possible a final promise which would never be broken again. So he says, so on May 28th of 1830, Sharp Knife's recommendations, Sharp Knife being Andrew Jackson, his recommendations to his Congress became law. So 2 years later, he appointed a commissioner of Indian Affairs to serve in the War Department and see that the new laws affecting Indians were properly carried out. And then on June 30th in 1834, Congress passed an act to regulate trade and intercourse with the Indian tribes and to preserve peace on the frontiers. That was the name of the act. And all that part of the United States west of the Mississippi and not within the states of Missouri and Louisiana or the territory of Arkansas would be Indian country. No white persons would be permitted to trade in the Indian country without a license. No white traders of bad character, traders, D-E-R-S. No white traders of bad character would be permitted to reside in Indian country. No white persons would be permitted to settle in Indian country. This is west of the Mississippi. And the military force of the United States would be employed in the apprehension of any white person who was found in violation of provisions of the act. Now, before these laws could be put into effect, a new wave of white settlers swept westward and formed the territories of Wisconsin, and Iowa. And this made it necessary for the policymakers in Washington to, we got to shift the permanent Indian frontier from the Mississippi River to the 95th meridian. And this line ran from Lake of the Woods on what's now the Minnesota-Canadian border. Lake of the Woods, if you look at a map of Minnesota, I've been up to Lake of the Woods. Gorgeous up there. This is what they call the Boundary Waters territory. It's in the north of Minnesota and over into Canada. It's about 6 hours north of here by car. So the new line ran from Lake of the Woods on what's now the Minnesota-Canadian border, slicing southward through what's now the states of Minnesota and Iowa, and then along the western borders of Missouri, Arkansas, and Louisiana to Galveston Bay, Texas. Straight south. And to keep the Indians beyond the 95th meridian, west of it, and to prevent unauthorized white men from crossing over into it, soldiers were garrisoned in a series of military posts that ran southward from Fort Snelling, where Rocky and Rainey and Sarah and I have been a couple of times. I've been there many, many times, by the way. I grew up with Fort Snelling in my backyard in Minneapolis. And so it started southward from Fort Snelling on the Mississippi River to Forts Atkinson, Leavenworth in Missouri, Forts Gibson and Smith on the Arkansas, Fort Townsend on the Red, and Fort Jessup in Louisiana. So more than 3 centuries had now passed since Columbus landed in San Salvador, and more than 2 centuries since the English colonists came to Virginia and New England. And in that time, the friendly Tainos who welcomed Columbus ashore had been utterly obliterated. Long before the last of the Tainos died, their simple agricultural and handicraft culture was destroyed and replaced by cotton plantations worked by slaves. The white colonists chopped down the tropical forests to enlarge their fields. The cotton plants exhausted the soil. Winds unbroken by a forest shield covered the fields with sand. And when Columbus first saw the island, he described it as very big, very level, and trees very green. The whole of it so green that it was a pleasure to gaze upon. And the Europeans who followed him there destroyed its vegetation, its inhabitants, human, animal, bird, and fish, and after turning it to a wasteland, they abandoned it. That's all we've got time for tonight. You can see why I want to pick this up again tomorrow and look at this more. I think this is important history that we learn and we know and we understand. That's all I got tonight. Think on these things. 23-hour break. I'll see you tomorrow. Have a good night.